And we already introduced everyone, and again, it's a pleasure and honor to have all these speakers. And I really want to emphasize, everybody here, right, on this panel, including yourselves, have spent their own time, and we are not giving them an honorarium, even I wish we could. But I think that really needs to be emphasized on how important this issue is to their lives, right? They're not here trying to, try to change only if they get paid. And I think this is really speaks volumes for all these people that are very busy in their schedule. So without any further ado, Jamie, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's funny, when I was asked to speak on the panel, I wasn't exactly sure, what would be the best tack to take in terms of what angle to come at this conversation from. And I had written an article, I think that's kind of how I got connected. I had written an article that's been shared pretty widely called Racism, Appropriation, and the Harlem Shake. And within that conversation, a lot of what has come from that conversation for me, both in conversations on Facebook and in the comments on the blog, has been, how do we resist, right? What does resistance look like to this kind of cultural appropriation? And I think that's a particularly unique question being asked of a white person. I identify as a white person. And so there's a few things that I want to say about resistance, but I also want to couch that within the conversation of that I'm a person who, it has done plenty of appropriation in my life. I'm a white person, and I think it's very common, even for white people who are not, if any white person is not paying attention, we're probably appropriating, right? And so in thinking about this conversation, it's important that we recognize that this is not an isolated event, right? Appropriation is happening in countless different ways, when I'm talking about appropriation, I'm specifically talking about people of power and privilege appropriating things from cultures that are not theirs. I think that a lot of times I get people asking me questions about, well, what happens if a black person appropriates something from like European culture? And I'm like, okay, well, let's talk about power, oppression, and privilege, right? Because anytime we're talking about resistance, we need to recognize that this conversation is one about power and oppression. And when white folks are appropriating, what we are doing is divorcing something from its origins. Because when let's say a person of color appropriates something from white culture or borrows something from white culture, there's no danger that is going to divorce white people from their culture in the sense that A, white people have already given up much of our culture in order to become white, and B, we still have control over our own narratives, and that's not something that all people can boast in our media and in our world around us. And so, when we're looking at how all the different ways that this is happening, it's happening to different aspects of Latino culture, and it's happening to Asians and Pacific Islanders, and just recently, a St. Paul police officer, there was this big controversy with a St. Paul police officer dressing as a Somali woman. That's appropriation. That's what we're talking about, right? And so I think it's important to address that in two different ways. One is that it's important that if we recognize this is happening in countless different contexts, we need to be understanding how we can build coalitions. And I don't need to preach that to most folks of color because it's already happening in the sense that there are already coalitions, across racial difference that exist, that are working to resist appropriation. But specifically talking to white folks in the room and those who are watching live streaming, it's important to recognize that we cannot divorce ourselves from this. We cannot separate ourselves from this because, again, if we're not paying attention, if we're not actively taking part in resistance, then we're complicit. And so, in building coalitions, we have to recognize that coalitions are necessary because if we act alone, then we're not likely to have any effect. Only when we act in concert are we likely to affect things. But for white folks, what that means is that we have to really try to kind of have an understanding or an ethic of being allies, of understanding what it means to be an ally. And that's a whole separate talk that we can have on a separate day, but just in short, we need to be thinking about ways that A, we can call out our own people, that we can talk to other white people, right? And so, when I see white folks getting really defensive about, oh, the Harlem, it's just fun, we're just having fun, which I know that you're going to be talking about in just a little bit, but when I hear them saying that, it's important that we are the ones speaking up and talking to other white people and engaging other white people in that conversation. And then also, when we're looking at what it looks like to build coalitions, we have to be thinking about how we can make sure that we are stepping back, that we are making sure that we don't have to be the ones out in front, we don't have to be the leaders. Instead, that we are supporting and we are listening. Listening is vital, listening is the root of justice. And within that, recognizing that we need to help by talking to our own people and helping to create that space and helping to hold that space so that folks who are traditionally denied voices in our communities, whether it's at Hamline or in our home communities, those people who are traditionally denied voices, we can help hold that space there. And then within that, I think it's important to recognize that we have to have a conversation about privilege, right? Like we have to have a conversation with folks of privilege, in this case when we're talking about racial appropriation with white folks, about privilege, because privilege conceals itself from those who have it, right? It's one of those things where if you have privilege, of course you can't see it. It's your own little goodie bag. Why are you going to pay attention to that? Versus everyone else can see it plain as day. And so we have to begin to have conversations around deconstructing that privilege and checking privilege and understanding what privileges it is we have, because it is inherently a privilege to think that everything is available to us, to think that every bit of culture is ours to take, ours to use, ours, and ours to engage with, right? And so that's one of the most important conversations that we can be having. And then also working in concert with other people and actually being accountable to other people. Because when you mentioned Macklemore, Dr. Hodge, I think that's a really interesting example, because Macklemore, and I have plenty of criticisms to make about where he is today, but where he comes from is he is grounded in a community of hip-hop artists of color in Seattle, and he is, at least for a long time, has been, to my understanding, pretty accountable within that community. But that's a wholly different thing than if there's a white person making hip-hop music who has no community of color who can hold them accountable, who can check them, who can, those kinds of things. And so that's part of what it means to check in with our privileges, to engage in coalitions. And then the last thing that I want to say is we have an incredible power, particularly thinking about the young people or the very tech-savvy people who are in the room. We have an incredible power that I think Chris was able to demonstrate with his video, to use social media and memes against the systems of power, oppression, and privilege, right? And within that, you have to note that the video that was done by the original Harlem Shakers, and it showed them kind of like in a cafeteria, and it started out with one of them kind of going along with the meme, humping the air, and then it stops and it's like, no, that's not the Harlem Shake. This is the Harlem Shake, and then they broke it down. That video has 2.1 million hits. That's resistance. Right? That's an example of using this meme against itself. And so if we can think creatively about how we can use memes and against themselves, then we can start to turn that power. And that's one of the things that the internet can be a really powerful tool for reinforcing systems or for breaking down systems, depending on how it's used. And so if we think creatively about how we can engage those memes, we can engage those tools, then we have the power to break that down. So just as one example, last summer, I was asked to give a keynote at a sexual violence prevention conference about how we can use sort of creative, fun ways to engage people in conversations around sexual violence. And that was at the time when everybody was remaking the Carly Rae Jepsen "Call Me Maybe," right? Everybody's remaking it. And so some friends and I, we rewrote the lyrics to make it about consent, "Ask Me Maybe," right? And we reshot the whole video, and we've had about 5,000 hits. Now that's not viral, that's not crazy, but imagine a room full of 5,000 people, right? Like you're reaching 5,000 people who you otherwise wouldn't reach, right? So even if your iteration doesn't go viral, like Chris's was able to, there are ways that we can use the internet as forms of resistance. I'll leave it with that.
Thank you so much. And now